You know what really kills me about golden anniversaries? It's the smell. It's that cheap lemon polish covering up the rot underneath a total phony show for people who don't even like you. I'm Emma Thompson, and tonight I'm catering for the parents who ruined my life. 20 years ago, they left me in a rainy parking lot because I wouldn't lie to the cops about my brother's DUI. They chose their reputation over me. Now they're celebrating 50 years of bliss, unaware that the woman serving them is the daughter they threw away. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Let's get this over with. The air in the Grand Oak Banquet Hall always smelled the same industrial-strength lemon furniture polish dust and the stale anxiety of 1,000 forgotten weddings. It was the smell of forced celebration. I ran my thumb along the edge of a charger plate at table 4. It was aligned perfectly with the rim of the table exactly 1 inch from the edge. I checked the crystal, spot-free. I checked the floral centerpiece, white lilies aggressive in their scent, and shifted a single fern frond 3 millimeters to the left. Check the water glasses on table 9, I said into my headset. My voice was low, flat, and absolute. One of them has a smudge near the rim. Replace it. On it, Ms. Thompson, my floor manager's voice crackled back. I was 36 years old, and I had built Thompson Catering and Events from a basement kitchen into the premier service provider in the state. I didn't just sell food. I sold invisible perfection. My clients were wealthy, demanding, and often hysterical, but they paid my exorbitant fees because I ensured their chaos never reached the dinner table. I was efficient. I was wealthy. I was respected. And currently, I was holding on to the back of a banquet chair because my knees felt like they were made of water. I caught my reflection in the darkened window of the main hall. I barely recognized myself, which was the point. I had pulled my hair back into a bun, so severe it pulled at the skin of my temples. I wore thick-rimmed tortoiseshell glasses that I didn't actually need. My suit was black, shapeless, and high-collared. I looked like a shadow, a piece of the furniture. I looked like the help. I had to. I checked my watch. 5:45 p.m. The guests would arrive in 15 minutes. I needed air. I walked out to the lobby, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. I told myself I was just doing a final perimeter check, but my feet dragged me toward the easel set up near the entrance. It was a photo collage mounted on foam board draped in gold ribbon. Robert and Martha, 50 years of golden bliss. I stared at the photos. There were pictures of them on a boat in the Cape, pictures of them cutting a cake at their 25th, pictures of my brother David looking handsome and hollow in his varsity jacket. And there, buried in the bottom corner, was me. I was 16 in the photo. I was wearing a blue dress that I remembered hating because the lace scratched my neck. I was smiling, but the smile didn't reach my eyes. My posture was stiff as if I were bracing for a blow. Looking at that girl was like touching a live wire. The smell of the lemon polish vanished. The humming of the hall's air conditioning faded. Suddenly, I was cold. Bone-deep, shivering, cold. It was raining. That's the first thing I remembered about that night, not the sirens, but the rain. It was a Tuesday in November 20 years ago. The rain wasn't a cleanse. It was a freezing, miserable sleet that turned the asphalt of the sheriff's station parking lot into a black mirror. I was standing outside the heavy metal doors, hugging my arms across my chest. My brother David was sitting on the curb. He was 18. He was crying his head between his knees, smelling of cheap beer and fear. He had put the family station wagon into a ditch. He wasn't hurt, but he had blown a 12 on the breathalyzer. A police cruiser idled nearby, its red and blue lights cutting through the sleet, making the wet pavement pulse with color. Then the headlights of my father's sedan swept over us. Robert and Martha didn't run to us. They marched. My father held a large umbrella over my mother, but he didn't offer to share it when he reached us. The water dripped off the rim of the umbrella and hit my shoulder. "Where is the deputy?" my father asked. He didn't ask if we were hurt. He didn't look at David. He looked at the building. "Inside," I whispered. "He's doing the paperwork." "David," my mother hissed. She was wearing her bridge coat, the beige wool one she only wore to church. "Look at me. Did you tell them? Did you tell them you were driving?" David looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with panic. "Mom, He has the scholarship, Robert," my mother said, turning to my father. Her voice was rising tight with a panic that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with reputation. "If he has a DUI on his record, the university pulls the offer. You know they will." My father turned to me. He was a tall man, and in the dark with the rain slicking his hair down, he looked like a statue. "Emma." "Yes, Daddy." "You were driving." It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. "What?" I stepped back, the cold water soaking through my canvas sneakers. "You're a minor," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You're 16. The juvenile records are sealed. It won't follow you. It won't matter." "But I wasn't driving," I said, my voice shaking. "I was at the library. You came and picked me up to bring me here because they called you." "Don't get technical with me, Emma," my mother snapped. "This is your brother's future. He made a mistake, a simple mistake. Are you going to let his life be ruined because you're too selfish to take a little heat?" "It's not a mistake, he's drunk," I yelled, the tears finally spilling over hot against my cold cheeks. "He could have killed someone. I won't lie to the police. I won't." My father stepped closer. He didn't hit me. He never hit me. He used words like chisels. "We protect this family, Emma. That is what we do. If you go in there and tell that officer the truth, you are choosing to hurt us. You are choosing to be an enemy of this family." "I can't," I sobbed. "Please don't make me." They looked at each other. A silent communication passed between them, a decision made in a heartbeat. "Fine," my father said. He grabbed David by the arm and hauled him up. "Get in the car, David." "Dad," David slurred, "get in the car." They began to walk away. They walked toward the dry, warm sedan. "Wait," I called out. "I need a ride home." My mother stopped. She turned back. The red light from the police cruiser washed over her face, making her look demonic for a split second. "Family rides in the car, Emma. You made your choice." She got in. The doors slammed. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty lot. I watched the taillights fade into the darkness. I stood there for 10 minutes thinking they would turn around, thinking it was a lesson, a scare tactic. They didn't come back. I walked 5 miles in the freezing rain. When I finally got to the house, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they would crack, I reached for my key. I slid it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I jiggled it. I pushed it. Then I realized the lock hadn't been changed. The deadbolt had been engaged from the inside, the kind you can't open with a key. I knocked. Then I pounded. Then I screamed. The lights in the living room were on. I could see the shadows moving behind the curtains. They were home. They just weren't home for me. Ms. Thompson. The voice brought me back. I gasped, sucking in the stale air of the banquet hall. I was standing in the lobby, clutching the easel so hard my knuckles were white. My head server, Julian, was looking at me with concern. The doors are opening. The first car just pulled up. I straightened my jacket. I forced my hands to uncurl. I pushed the 16-year-old girl back into the dark corner of my mind where she lived. I'm fine, Julian. Go to your stations. The heavy double doors swung open. A gust of evening wind blew in, followed by an elderly couple. Robert walked with a cane, now his posture slightly stooped, but his chin was still lifted in that familiar, arrogant tilt. Martha was beside him, wearing a gold sequin dress that looked too heavy for her thin frame. They were smiling, but it was a brittle, practiced expression. I watched them greet the empty air, apologizing to no one about the traffic. They looked terrified. They looked like two people desperately trying to convince the world they mattered. My stomach turned over a violent lurch of nausea. I could leave. I could walk out the back door, get in my Mercedes, and drive away. I had the money. I had the power. But I had a contract. And more than that, I had a point to prove. I adjusted my glasses, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the shadows. I would serve them. I would fill their glasses and clear their plates. I would be the perfect, invisible servant they always treated me as. And when the night was over, I would hand them the bill. "Welcome to the Grand Oak," I whispered to myself. "Let the show begin." I slipped into the service corridor that ran parallel to the main ballroom, a narrow artery of scuffed linoleum and fluorescent light that the guests were never meant to see. Here the air didn't smell like lemon polish. It smelled of commercial dish sanitizer and reduced balsamic glaze. I adjusted my headset, pressing the earpiece deeper into my ear canal. "Julian," I murmured, "hold the second course. The speeches haven't started and they're already lagging on the salad. Let's not rush them." "Copy that, Ms. Thompson." Julian's voice came back tight with the specific stress of a headwaiter trying to manage a room that lacked energy. I found my vantage point, a small, recessed alcove near the beverage station where the wall curved. Through the gap in the heavy velvet curtains, I could see the entire grand oak floor without being seen. It was a trick I had mastered early in my career. To run a perfect event, you had to be a ghost, omnipresent but invisible. What I saw made my chest ache with a cold, dull familiarity. The room was set for 150. We had prepped 150, fillets 150, lobster bisques 150, gold-rimmed chargers. But the room was at best a third full. The emptiness of a banquet hall is a specific kind of violence. It amplifies everything. The clink of a fork against a tooth sounds like a gunshot. A cough echoes. The gaps between the tables looked like missing teeth. My parents had tried to hide it. I watched my mother, Martha, gesturing frantically to the venue manager earlier, demanding that reserved signs be placed on the empty tables to suggest that 50 people had simply been delayed by a multi-car pileup on the interstate, rather than the reality that 50 people simply hadn't cared enough to come. I watched them now at the head table. They sat on a raised dais like royalty of a crumbling kingdom. My father, Robert, was tearing a dinner roll apart with unnecessary force. He leaned over to Martha, his whisper harsh enough to carry to my hiding spot. I told you the invites went out too late. The post office is incompetent. It's not the post office, Robert. Martha hissed back, her smile fixed rigidly in place for the benefit of no one. It's people today. No respect for tradition, no sense of obligation. We would never have missed the Millers' anniversary, and yet look at their table. Empty. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes scanning the room, tallying the slights, calculating the social debt. She looked terrified. For Martha, being unloved was bearable, but being irrelevant was a death sentence. Then my eyes shifted to the man sitting to her right, David. He was 38 now. The boyish softness I remembered from the police station parking lot was gone, replaced by the sharp angles of a man who had run a marathon through hell. He was lean, wearing a suit that fit him well but looked modest compared to my father's bespoke tailoring. His hands were folded on the table, perfectly still. A photographer. Henderson, a man with a kind face and a weary slump to his shoulders, approached the dais. "If I could just get a family toast," Henderson asked, lifting his camera. My father immediately brightened, the mask of the patriarch sliding back into place. Of course, a toast to 50 years." He grabbed a bottle of champagne from the cooler and moved to fill David's glass. David placed his hand over the rim. "No, thank you, Dad. I'm good with the seltzer." My father froze. The smile faltered. "David, don't be difficult. It's a picture. You don't have to chug it. Just hold the flute." "I'd rather not hold it." "Dad," David said. His voice was calm, low, and anchored. It was the voice of someone who had practiced saying no in therapy for a decade. "For God's sake," my mother snapped, leaning across Robert. "It ruins the aesthetic, David. A water glass looks pedestrian. Just hold the champagne. Do it for us. It's one night." It's one night. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. It was the same logic they had used on me in the rain. Just lie for one night. Just sacrifice your integrity for one night so we look good. David didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply moved the champagne flute 6 inches away from his setting, out of his reach, and picked up his water. "I'm toasting with this, Mom. Take the picture." My father scowled, looking as if David had spit on the tablecloth. "Fine, have it your way. Ruin the symmetry." They took the photo. Robert and Martha beamed with blinding manufactured joy, raising their crystal flutes. David smiled, a small, real sad smile, raising his water glass. I pulled back from the curtain, my breath hitching in my throat. They hadn't learned a thing. They were still willing to risk their son's sobriety for a symmetrical photograph. They would burn their children to keep themselves warm. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt a profound, exhausting pity. "Hush. Miss Thompson, wait." The shout came from the kitchen behind me. I spun around, my professional armor locking back into place. Julian was rushing toward me, his face pale. Behind him on the stainless steel prep table was a disaster. A tray of the scallop appetizers, seared to perfection, topped with a delicate saffron foam, had been upended. 12 servings smashed. "What happened?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "New busboy," Julian whispered, tilting his head toward a teenager who looked ready to weep. "He turned too fast. Clipped the edge." "Clean it up," I said. "Plate the reserves. We have a buffer of 20 plates because of the low attendance. It's fine." "That's not the problem," Julian hissed. "The problem is them." He pointed toward the swing doors leading to the ballroom. "The parents." The father saw the busboy drop it through the door window. He's demanding to speak to the incompetent manager who hires clumsy children. He's threatening to dock the fee. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. Of course he was. Robert never missed an opportunity to exert control over service staff. It was his favorite blood sport. "I'll handle it," I said. "Do you want me to go?" Julian asked. "You know how particular these clients are." "No," I said, smoothing the front of my jacket. "He asked for the owner. He gets the owner." I walked to the mirror by the hand-washing station. I checked my bun, not a hair out of place. I pushed my glasses up my nose. I checked my expression. It was blank. It was a mirror. I pushed through the double doors. The transition was jarring. I went from the bright, noisy safety of the kitchen into the dim, murmuring judgment of the hall. I walked the length of the room. I felt the eyes of the 50 guests on me. I didn't look at them. I walked with the stride of a woman who owns the building, even if I felt like the girl who had been locked out of it. I reached the dais. My father was red-faced, pointing a finger at the empty spot on the table where the scallops should have been. "Sir," I said. My voice was an octave lower than my natural speaking voice, controlled, resonant. "I understand there is a concern regarding the service." Robert didn't look up at my face. He looked at my shoes, then my suit, dismissing me by assessing the cost of my clothing. "A concern I'm paying a fortune for white glove service. And I'm watching your staff throw food on the floor like we're in a cafeteria. Who is supervising these people?" "I am," I said, "and the replacement course is being plated as we speak. It will be out in 90 seconds. "It disrupts the flow," he grumbled, finally glancing up. His eyes washed over me without a flicker of recognition. To him, I was just a function, a suit, a utility. "We have a schedule, Miss—" "What is it?" "Thompson," I said. Martha turned. She had been picking at the tablecloth, but at the sound of the name, common as it was, she froze. She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff with age and tension. She looked at me, really looked at me. Her eyes narrowed behind her bifocals. She took in the severe hair, the heavy glasses, the lack of makeup. She was looking for the 16-year-old girl with the messy ponytail and the defiant eyes. She didn't find her. She found a stranger. But she found something. "Thompson," she repeated. Her voice was thin, reedy. "Have we used your firm before you look familiar?" My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the trap. If I flinched, if I showed emotion, she would know. "I don't believe so, ma'am." I lied. "We handle mostly corporate contracts in the city. This is our first time at the Grand Oak." Martha hummed, unconvinced. She leaned back, crossing her arms over her sequins. "Well, you have a very specific walk. My daughter used to walk like that, heavy-footed." It was a dig. Even when she didn't know it was me, she couldn't help but criticize the ghost of me. "I apologize if my gait is distracting," I said, reaching for the bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon on the table. "Allow me to top this off while you wait for the scallops." I moved to her side. I had poured wine 10,000 times. I could do it in my sleep. But as I brought the bottleneck over her crystal glass, my hand trembled. Just a micro tremor. Martha saw it. "Careful," she snapped. "Don't spill it on the linens. God, good help is so hard to find these days. Everyone is so jittery. Good help is so hard to find." The memory flashed. Good daughters are hard to find. That's what she had said to the police officer that night. My daughter is usually so responsible. I don't know why she's lying to you." I stared at the red wine swirling into the glass. It looked like blood. I had the power right now. I could drop the bottle. I could tell her right here in front of her 50 friends that the heavy-footed walk came from walking 5 miles in the rain because she abandoned me. I could shatter her fragile little party into a million pieces. But then I looked at David. He was watching me. He wasn't looking at the wine. He was looking at my hands. He frowned slightly, a spark of confusion lighting in his eyes. He recognized the hands. I couldn't do it to him. Not yet. I finished the pour with a twist of the wrist to catch the drip. I wrapped the bottle in white linen. "The scallops will be out momentarily," I said, my voice devoid of anything human. "Enjoy the evening. Try to keep your staff from breaking anything else," Robert muttered, already turning away to wave at a guest. "Of course, sir." I walked away. I didn't run. I walked with the same heavy-footed cadence. She despised every step, a deliberate act of defiance. I went back to the shadows, my heart rate slowing, my resolve hardening into diamond. They wanted a show. Fine. The main course was coming. The dinner plates had been cleared. The coffee cups were being placed with soft ceramic clicks. The lights in the grand oak ballroom dimmed, leaving the room bathed in the amber glow of the wall sconces and the harsh, singular spotlight trained on the head table. I stood by the cake table, in the corner, shrouded in the semi-darkness. My hands were gloved in white cotton. I was preparing the heavy silver knife for the ceremonial cutting. It was a beautiful tool, an antique serrated blade with a mother-of-pearl handle, heavy and cold. "Ladies and gentlemen," the DJ's voice boomed, overly cheerful for a room that felt like a funeral wake. "If I could have your attention for a few words from the man of the hour, Mr. Robert Thompson." My father stood up. He adjusted his tie, touched his cufflinks, and took the microphone. He looked every inch the patriarch's silver-hair tailored suit, a smile that didn't quite reach his shark-like eyes. I gripped the handle of the cake knife. My knuckles turned white. "Thank you all for coming." Robert began, his voice smooth, practiced. 50 years, it sounds like a long time. But when you are building a life with a woman like Martha, it passes in the blink of an eye. A polite, scattered applause rippled through the 50 guests. "We have built a legacy." Robert continued, his gaze drifting over the heads of the audience, looking at a horizon that didn't exist. "We have raised children. We have built a home. And through it all, we held on to one core value: unity, loyalty." I felt a muscle in my jaw jump. "There were storms," he said, dropping his voice to a theatrical whisper. "Oh, there were storms. Times when the world tried to tear us apart. Times when we had to make impossible sacrifices to protect our children, to shield them from the cruelty of the world." My breath hitched. "Shield us." I looked at David. He was staring at his water glass, his jaw tight. "But we did it," Robert said, his voice rising, swelling with unearned pride. "We protected this family's name. We weathered the betrayal of those who didn't understand what family means. We stood tall so that our son," he gestured grandly to David, "could become the man he is today. A success, a pillar." Betrayal. He was talking about me. He was standing there rewriting the history of the worst night of my life, turning his abandonment of a 16-year-old girl into a heroic act of protection. He was cannibalizing my trauma to feed his ego. The room began to spin. The hum of the air conditioning roared in my ears. We have always put our children first, Robert concluded, beaming at Martha. We sacrificed everything for their integrity. Liar. The word screamed in my head loud enough that I was terrified I had spoken it. The rage, cold and 20 years old, finally crested the wall I had built around it. My hand spasmed. The heavy silver cake knife slipped from my gloved fingers. It hit the parquet dance floor with a sound that shattered the room, a loud, dissonant clang, clatter, clang that echoed off the high ceilings. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert stopped mid-sentence. The feedback from the microphone whined. Every head in the room turned toward the corner, toward the cake, toward me. I stood frozen, my hand still half raised, the empty space where the knife had been throbbing. Martha stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the floor. The veneer of the gracious hostess evaporated instantly. The rage she had been suppressing all night at the empty tables, at the bad food, at the clumsy staff, found its target. "You," she screeched, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You clumsy, incompetent. Who hired you? You've been lurking around all night, skulking in the corners." I didn't move. I couldn't. I was looking at my father. He looked annoyed, disgusted. Martha marched around the table, stepping into the edge of the spotlight. She squinted, her face contorting. She was 10 feet away, then 5. She stopped. The anger on her face didn't vanish. It curdled into something uglier. Recognition. "I know you," she whispered. The microphone on the table behind her picked it up, broadcasting her shock to the room. "I know those eyes." She took a step back as if I were contagious. "You're not a caterer." I reached up. My hand felt heavy like lead. I pulled the pins from my hair. The severe bun unspooled my dark hair falling around my shoulders. I took off the thick-rimmed glasses and placed them on the cake table next to the tiered lemon chiffon. I straightened my spine. I was no longer the help. "Hello, Mother," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the room it carried to the back wall. A collective gasp went through the room. The guests exchanged looks, confusion, excitement. This was the drama they had been sensing all night, finally erupting. "Emma!" Robert's voice came over the speakers, tinny and incredulous. He looked at me like I was a ghost. "What are you doing here?" "I'm working, Robert," I said, using his first name. It felt like a slap. "I own Thompson Catering. You hired my company." You own this?" Martha looked around the room at the staff standing at attention, at the silver, at the flowers. "You did this." "I did," I said. "I'm the only reason this room looks halfway decent. I'm the only reason there's food on the table." Robert's face went red, a deep, vascular flush. He didn't see a successful daughter. He saw a threat. He saw a loose thread that could unravel his tapestry of lies. "You came here to humiliate us," he accused, his voice booming. "You waited 20 years and you came here to crash our anniversary. After everything we did for you." "Everything you did for me." I stepped out from behind the cake table. I walked into the light. "You mean leaving me in a sheriff's station parking lot in the rain? You mean locking the deadbolt so I couldn't get back into my own home?" "We were protecting the family," Robert shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "We were protecting David. You were selfish. You refused to help your brother when he needed you most." "I refused to commit a felony," I shouted back, my professional mask shattering. "I refused to lie to the police. I was 16, and you threw me away like garbage because I wouldn't perjure myself for your reputation." Security, Robert yelled, waving frantically at the back of the room. Get her out of here. She's trespassing. She's mentally unstable. Two of the venue's security guards hesitated near the doors, looking between me and the screaming old man. I am the vendor on contract, I said, my voice icy. If you remove me, my staff leaves with me. The coffee, the dessert, the service, it all goes. I don't care, Martha shrieked. She was shaking, clutching her pearls. I want her gone. She's ruined everything, just like she tried to ruin David. She turned to David, who was still sitting staring at the tablecloth. David, tell them. Tell them how she turned her back on you. Tell them what a sister is supposed to do. The room held its breath. All eyes turned to David, the golden boy, the reason for the sacrifice. David stood up. He moved slowly like a man waking up from a long, deep sleep. He picked up the microphone his father had dropped. David, Robert warned, his voice low. Sit down. We'll handle this. David looked at his father. Then he looked at his mother. Finally, he looked at me across the dance floor. His eyes were wet, but his expression was stone. No, David said. The feedback whined again. David, Martha whispered. David turned to the guests. My father is lying. The silence in the room changed frequency. It went from awkward to electric. The accident 20 years ago, David said, his voice gaining strength. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a one-time thing. I was a drunk. I had been drinking since I was 15. David, stop this, Robert hissed, reaching for the mic. David pulled away, stepping off the dais onto the floor. He walked toward me. I was an addict, and that night I was wasted. I crashed the car. I could have killed someone. He stopped 5 feet from me. He didn't look at the guests anymore. He looked only at me. Mom and Dad? They wanted Emma to take the fall, David said. They wanted to bail me out. They wanted to fix it so I wouldn't have a record, so I could keep my scholarship, so I could keep playing the part. He took a ragged breath. If Emma had said yes, David said, his voice cracking, if she had taken the blame, I would have walked away thinking I was invincible. I would have kept drinking. I know I would have. I would have killed myself or someone else within a year. Martha let out a sob, her hand over her mouth. Emma said no, David said. She stood in the rain and said no. And because she said no, I lost my license. I lost the scholarship. I had to do community service. I had to go to rehab. He turned back to his parents. They looked shrunken, deflated under the harsh light. You didn't save me, David said to them. You almost loved me to death. You cared more about how I looked than who I was. He pointed at me. She saved me. Her betrayal is the only reason I'm standing here sober today. She let me hit bottom. That was the only act of love that actually mattered. He dropped his hand. I've been sober for 10 years, and every day of it I owe to the sister you threw away. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The narrative Robert had spun for 2 decades, the story of the ungrateful daughter and the saintly parents, dissolved. Martha sank into her chair, looking suddenly ancient. Robert opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at the guests, but no one was meeting his eyes. They were looking at their plates or at me with a dawning, horrified realization. The golden anniversary was over. The rot underneath the gold was exposed. I looked at David. A tear slid down his cheek. I'm sorry, Em, he whispered off mic. I'm so sorry. I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for 20 years. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a hollow, ringing clarity. I know, I whispered back. I turned to the room. The cake, I announced, my voice trembling only slightly, will be served shortly. My announcement hung in the air like a bad punchline. The cake will be served shortly. It was absurd. It was professional. It was the only thing I knew how to say. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The room was a vacuum. The 50 guests sat frozen, their hands hovering over their napkins, their eyes darting between the dais where my parents sat, like deposed monarchs, and the spot on the floor where I stood, the prodigal daughter in a caterer's uniform. Then the noise returned. But it wasn't the noise of a party. It was the sound of uncomfortable, shuffling chairs scraping back throats, clearing the soft zip of purses being closed. Robert sank back into his chair. The red flush on his face had drained away, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. He looked at the microphone in front of him, then at the guests. He opened his mouth to spin another narrative, to make a joke, to reclaim the room, but he closed it again. He was a salesman with no inventory left. The product he had been selling for 50 years, the perfect Thompson family, had just been recalled. Martha was the one who couldn't let go. "Well," she said. Her voice was brittle, high-pitched, a desperate chirping sound. She picked up her wine glass, her hand shaking so violently the liquid sloshed over the rim. David always did have a flair for the dramatic. Theater major, you know. He loves a monologue. She looked out at the guests, smiling a terrifying rictus smile. "Eat, everyone. It's just family banter. You know how it is, passionate families." No one picked up a fork. Mrs. Gable, a neighbor who had known us since I was 5, stood up at table 3. She didn't look at Martha. She looked at me, then at David. She placed her napkin on the table, picked up her clutch, and walked toward the exit. It started a chain reaction. "I think we should go," a man whispered at table 5. "Yeah, this is too much," his wife replied. They didn't storm out. There was no scene. It was worse than that. It was a quiet, embarrassed exodus. They were leaving because they were witnessing something private and necrotic, like walking in on a surgery where the anesthesia had failed. I looked at David. He hadn't moved from his spot on the dance floor. His shoulders were slumped, the adrenaline of his confession fading into exhaustion. He looked at me, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't see the golden boy who got everything I didn't. I saw a man who had been carrying a 10-ton weight up a mountain, just waiting for permission to drop it. I gave him a small nod. "I see you." He closed his eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you." The room was emptying fast. The grand oak was returning to its natural state, a cavernous, lonely hall. My parents were left alone at the head table. Robert was staring at his hands. Martha was still smiling, her frozen smile watching the backs of her friends as they retreated. "They're just going for a smoke," Martha whispered to no one. "They'll be back for the cake." "Ma'am." The voice came from the shadows near the DJ booth. It was deep, gravelly, and calm. Mr. Henderson, the event photographer, stepped into the circle of light. I had barely noticed him all night. He was a fixture of the local event circuit, a man in his 60s with a gray ponytail, a bad hip, and a reputation for being grumpy but expensive. He wore a utility vest filled with lenses and memory cards. He wasn't one of the young kids who shot digital and sprayed 1,000 frames a minute. Henderson waited. He was a sniper. He walked past me, nodding once respectfully. He limped up the 2 stairs to the dais and stopped in front of the head table. Martha looked up, startled. "Mr. Henderson, make sure you get a shot of the cake cutting. We want the unity shot." Henderson didn't lift his camera. He held it down by his hip, cradled in one hand like a weapon he was done using. "I'm done, Mrs. Thompson," he said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. "Done." Martha blinked. "But we haven't cut the cake." Henderson sighed. He shifted his weight off his bad hip. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 40 years. I've shot weddings, funerals, baptisms, and anniversaries. I know what love looks like through a lens, and I know what a lie looks like." Robert looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Are you lecturing me, Henderson? I'm paying you to take photos, not give moral instruction." "You paid me to capture the perfect moments," Henderson corrected. "That's what the contract says." He lifted the heavy camera. He pressed a button on the back and turned the small LCD screen toward them. "I took 400 photos tonight," Henderson said. 400 pictures of you two smiling, 400 pictures of you shaking hands, and every single one of them is dead. The light is wrong. The eyes are empty. It's just plastic." He tapped the screen. "Then I took this one." I stepped closer, compelled by the gravity in his voice. On the small glowing screen was a black and white image. It was grainy, shot in low light during David's speech. It wasn't a photo of the parents. It was a photo of David and me. In the frame, David was mid-sentence, his face contorted with the agony of his confession. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at me, and I was looking at him. My mask was gone. My face was stripped raw, pain vindication, and a fierce protective love that burned through the pixels. It was a photo of two people surviving a shipwreck together. It was ugly, it was messy, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "You can't Photoshop a legacy, folks," Henderson said quietly to my parents. "You can't airbrush that kind of pain, and you can't fake that kind of connection." He pointed to the screen. "That right there. That's the only real thing you produced in 50 years. Two kids who survived you." Martha stared at the screen. She squinted, leaning in. She looked at the image of her son's pain. She looked at the image of the daughter she had erased. For 20 years, Martha had curated her life. Every Christmas card, every newsletter, every outfit had been chosen to project an image of effortless perfection. She had convinced herself that if it looked good, it was good. But the camera didn't lie. The camera saw the cracks in the foundation. Look," Martha started, her voice trembling. "I'm not in it." "No, ma'am," Henderson said softly. "You're not." The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't the protagonist of the family story anymore. She wasn't even the villain. She was just absent. The love, the struggle, the reality, it was happening between David and me. She was just a spectator in an empty room. Martha's face crumbled. The frozen smile finally shattered, drooping into a mask of absolute despair. She put her hands over her face, her fingers digging into the expensive makeup, and let out a sound I had never heard her make. It wasn't a polite cry. It was a wail. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had spent 50 years building a castle out of sand, and the tide had just come in. Robert sat frozen next to her, staring at the camera screen, unable to look away from the proof of his own irrelevance. Henderson turned the camera off. He looked at me. "I'll email you the files, Ms. Thompson," he said. "On the house." He capped his lens, turned around, and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the hollowed-out hall. The sound of Mr. Henderson's footsteps faded into the corridor, leaving a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. The Grand Oak Banquet Hall was effectively a tomb. The guests were gone. The chairs at the round tables were pushed back in disarray, napkins crumpled on the floor like surrender flags. The air still hummed with the aggressive drone of the AC, but the human energy, the judgment, the pretense, the nervous laughter had evaporated. I stood by the cake table. My staff was frozen in the periphery, blending into the shadows, waiting for my command. Julian caught my eye from the kitchen doorway. He held a bus tub in his hands, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. Do we pack up? Do we leave? I looked at the head table. Robert and Martha sat amidst the wreckage of their golden anniversary. Martha had stopped wailing. Now she just sat with her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent rhythmic sobs. Robert was staring at a water stain on the tablecloth, his face gray and slack. They looked incredibly small. That was the thing that shocked me the most. In my memory, in my nightmares, they were giants. They were titans of judgment who could crush me with a word. Now, stripped of their audience and their narrative, they were just two elderly people sitting in a drafty room, terrified of the truth. I had the power to destroy them. I felt it in my chest, a hot, sharp knot. I could signal Julian to sweep the tables. I could turn on the ugly fluorescent work lights, stripping away the last of the amber romance. I could present them with the bill, a piece of paper, totaling thousands of dollars for a party no one enjoyed, and walk out, leaving them in the dark. It would be justice. It would be the ending the 16-year-old girl in the rain deserved. David was at my elbow. He had put his suit jacket back on, buttoning it with a sense of finality. He didn't look at our parents. He looked at the exit sign glowing red in the distance. You don't have to do anything else, he said softly. The contract is void. They breached it the minute they abused the staff. Let's just go. I'll drive. I looked at David. I saw the relief in his eyes, the lightness of a man who had finally set down a burden he'd been carrying for 2 decades. He was ready to walk away. He was free. I looked back at the cake. It was a masterpiece. 4 tiers of lemon chiffon draped in fondant, decorated with hand-pulled sugar lilies that had taken me 3 days to sculpt. It sat there uncut, a monument to a celebration that never happened. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Emma, seriously, David pressed. You don't owe them a damn thing, not a crumb. I know, I said. I'm not doing it for them. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver knife. The handle was cool against my palm. A few minutes ago, this knife had been a weapon, the catalyst for the explosion. Now it was just a tool. I stepped closer to the cake. I am a caterer, David, I said, positioning the blade over the bottom tier. I feed people. That is what I do. That is who I am. If I walked away now, leaving them hungry and humiliated in the dark, I would be reacting to them. I would be letting their cruelty dictate my behavior. I would remain the victim, lashing out from a place of pain. But I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a professional, and professionals finish the service. I pressed the knife down. It slid through the fondant and the sponge with a soft, yielding resistance. The scent of fresh lemon and vanilla released into the air, sharp, sweet, and clean. It was a smell of comfort. I cut two perfect triangular slices. I signaled Julian. He moved instantly, sliding two dessert plates onto the table next to me. I lifted the slices, balancing them on the china. I added the garnish, a single candied violet and a swirl of raspberry coulis. I didn't rush. I wiped the rim of the plates. I checked the presentation. It was flawless. I picked up the plates and walked toward the dais. The sound of my heels on the parquet floor was the only noise in the room. Click, click, click. Robert looked up as I approached. He flinched, pulling back slightly, as if he expected me to throw the plates at him. Martha lifted her head, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks, her eyes wide and fearful. They were waiting for the final blow. They were waiting for the scream, the curse, the rejection. They were waiting for me to be them. I set the first plate down in front of Robert. I aligned it with his silverware. I moved to the other side and set the second plate down in front of Martha. I stood back, clasping my hands behind my back. Eat, I said. The word hung there, simple and command-like. Martha looked at the cake, then up at me. Her lip trembled. Emma, it's lemon chiffon. I said, my voice steady, devoid of malice, but also devoid of warmth. It was always your favorite. The recipe is improved, but the profile is the same. I didn't offer a fork. They had their own silver. I didn't offer a napkin. Robert started, his voice cracking. He looked at the cake, then at me. He seemed to be struggling to comprehend the logic of the moment. Why? Because you are guests in my hall, I said, and in my hall, guests get fed. It was a rejection far more powerful than a scream. By serving them, I was declaring that I was whole. I was declaring that their ability to hurt me had expired. I was no longer the child begging to be let inside the house. I was the owner of the house, and I had the grace to offer them a seat at the table, even if they didn't deserve it. I turned my back on them. Julian, I said into my headset, give them 20 minutes to finish dessert, then clear the room and lock up. Bill the card on file for the full amount, including the overtime. Yes, chef, Julian whispered, respect thick in his voice. I walked toward David. He was staring at me, a look of awe on his face. He held the door open. We walked out of the ballroom, through the lobby, past the easel with the fake happy photos, and out the double doors. The night air was a shock, cold, crisp, and smelling of wet asphalt and pine. It was the same weather as that night 20 years ago, but the context had shifted entirely. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of a clean white moon. We walked to my car in silence. I unlocked it, the beep of the fob, a cheerful modern sound that dispelled the ghosts of the past. You're better than me, David said, leaning against the passenger door. I would have let them rot. No, you wouldn't, I said. You're the one who told the truth. I looked back at the grand oak banquet hall. The windows were dark except for the single spotlight burning in the center of the room. I could picture them in there. Two small figures in a vast, empty space eating lemon cake in silence. They were tasting the sweetness of a daughter they had thrown away. They were swallowing the reality of what they had lost. That was their punishment. And that was my peace. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't a sudden warm light. It wasn't something I had to give them. Forgiveness was just the act of putting down the knife. It was the decision to stop letting the past bleed into the present. I had served them. I had nourished the very people who had starved me. And in doing so, I had broken the cycle. I wasn't the girl in the rain anymore. I was the woman who made the cake. I got into the driver's seat. I adjusted the mirror not to look back, but to check the road behind me before pulling out. Where to? David asked. I put the car in gear. The engine purred smooth and reliable. I'm hungry, I said, and for the first time all night, my smile reached my eyes. Let's go get a burger. We drove away, leaving the golden anniversary behind us, dissolving into the rearview mirror until it was just a speck of light in the darkness. And then, finally, nothing at all. Sometimes, walking away is the ultimate victory. Have you ever faced a similar choice between your dignity and your family's approval? Don't be shy about sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.